Akhil Vaani urgent structural overhaul is the only hope for Indian prisons. In this series on reforms in the Indian judicial system, I have so far examined the complete breakdown of the system and made a case for comprehensive reforms in the country's policing. In this part, I take a deep dive into the evolution and current state of the prison system in India, examining what ails it and building a case for urgent structural reforms to be implemented on a fast-track basis. Before proceeding further, I begin with the assertion that Indian jails still remain a living hell and are in desperate need of urgent reform. One of the key reasons for the pathetic condition of jails is that, over the past 2 centuries, they have been among India's most neglected institutions. They have received the lowest priority, first under British colonial rule and then under successive state governments across the political spectrum since independence. In normal times, prisons receive a nominal budgetary outlay. In difficult times, the prison budget faces the harshest cuts. In this context, the observations of the 7th Finance Commission, headed by J. M. Shelat 1977-1979, are worth recalling. It noted facts show that jails have been neglected for too long and that there has been practically no improvement in the environment. On analyzing expenditure incurred on prisons, the Commission was perturbed to find that, with rare exceptions, the level of expenditure on prisoners had been extremely low. The National Crime Records Bureau (NCRB) annually releases data on the number of inmates languishing in Indian jails. As per the latest figures, on December 31, 2022, 5,73,000 Indians were incarcerated. The vast majority of them, 75.8%, were under trials. I submit that this statistic tells only half the story. There is no way to estimate the average number of Indians languishing in jail on any given day of the year. And to begin with, let me stress that this number is so large that the revolving door of Indian jails is now at a breaking point, teetering on the edge of complete collapse. Official data compiled by me reveals a harrowing picture. In the past decade alone, over 1 crore Indians have passed through the revolving door of the prison system. In just 2 years, 2021 and 2022, 18,06,823 and 18,04,787 people, respectively, were admitted to jails. In contrast, in 2021, 14,68,627 under trial prisoners and 93,077 convicts were released. In 2022, the corresponding numbers were 15,48,143 under trials and 1,25,533 convicts. Of the 15,48,143 under trial prisoners released in 2022, nearly 95% or 14,70,848 were released on bail. The living conditions in Indian jails make them a living hell and have remained so for over 200 years. Here is the story in brief. Circa 1856 IN 1856, Frederick J. Muat, a British surgeon and prison administrator based in Bengal, later a member of the 1864 Prison Inquiry Committee, presented the following bleak picture in his investigative report on the state of jails in Bengal, Bihar, and Arakan. It is difficult to imagine any fate more dreadful than that of the Indian life prisoner at present. His existence is one continued state of hopeless slavery, in which no attempt is made to reform him, and in which the only mitigation that good conduct and repentance can produce, is the removal of his irons. From this aimless existence, his only chance of release is death, and that he is too often anxious to court by acts of lawless violence towards those in whose custody he is placed. Circa 1980 The All India Committee on Jail Reform, headed by Justice A. N. Mullah, noted in circa 2023 in its 245th report titled Prison Conditions, Infrastructure, and Reforms, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Home Affairs presented to the Rajya Sabha on September 21, 2023 painted a harrowing picture. Prisons suffer from overcrowding, leading to a strain on resources, compromised living standards, increased tensions among inmates, lack of adequate healthcare facilities, sanitation and nutrition, outdated and dilapidated buildings, very high numbers of under trials and inadequate prison staff. Additionally, reports of abuse and human rights violations within these institutions have raised serious questions about the treatment and welfare of prisoners. Circa 2024 and 2025 The latest observations by 2 former Supreme Court justices further highlight the continued crisis. The preceding paragraphs have succinctly described what ails the Indian prison system. In this section, I examine a few existential issues in greater detail. Before doing so, I must highlight 3 basic recommendations of the All India Jail Committee 1919-1920, which remain unimplemented more than a century later. These were not, and here are a few existential issues that persist to this day. 1. Massive overcrowding. Indian jails are severely overcrowded. Between 2012 and 2022, the jail population surged from 3.8 lakh to 5.7 lakh, with the All India occupancy rate rising from 112% to 131%. Some critical observations. If that is not appalling enough, India Justice Report 2025 projects that the number of inmates will rise from the current 5.7 lakh to over 6.8 lakh by 2030. 2. Galloping number of under trials. The rapidly increasing number of under trials reflects the deeper breakdown of India's criminal justice system. The proportion of under trial inmates has steadily risen from 54% in 1978 to 60% in 1980, 68% in 2017, and an alarming 75.8% in 2022. As of December 31, 2022, an additional concerns regarding under-trial inmates' longer detention periods. Under trials are spending increasingly longer durations in pre-trial detention. In 2022, 1 in 4 under trials had been in jail for 13 years. In Uttar Pradesh, 40% of under trials had been incarcerated for more than 5 years. 4 categories of under trialees. All 4 categories are increasing rapidly. The poorest suffer the most. A disproportionately high number of under trials come from the lowest social, educational, and economic strata. Retribution over reform. In 1920, the All India Jail Committee recommended that reform and rehabilitation of inmates be the primary duty of prisons. More than 100 years later, Indian jails are still defined by vengeance, retribution, deterrence, and harsh punishment. 3 Acute staff shortage. Overcrowding is further worsened by severe shortages in prison staffing. Key statistics. 4 Disregard for mental health of inmates. The deterioration of mental health is an inevitable consequence of incarceration, made worse by deplorable living conditions. Though the Mental Health Care Act, 2017, mandates that all prison medical officers be trained to provide basic and emergency mental health care, implementation remains dismal. According to the India Justice Report 2025, jails must act as correctional institutions with the primary duty to reform and rehabilitate inmates. Contrarily, jails in India remain a living hell. The question that begs an answer is, why are Indian jails in such a sorry state, and why are their conditions deteriorating by the day? Why are no concerted efforts being made to convert Indian jails into livable corrective institutions? Ironically, no institution in the country has been subjected to more scrutiny than jails, but all steps to reform them have failed owing to 2 blunders, statutory and constitutional. Firstly, the transfer of prisoners from the centre to the provinces in the Government of India Act, 1935, and secondly, Schedule 7 of the Constitution, where, as per item number 4 in List 2, prisons fall under the responsibility of the states. In search of reforms, efforts during British Raj and the more important reforms included reform and rehabilitation of inmates, measures to prevent imprisonment, steps to shorten prison tenure, and aid to inmates on release to enable them to take their place in society and become useful citizens. Had even half of the above reforms been implemented, we would have been living in a different Bharat today. But it was not to be. All India Jail Committee recommendations were not implemented because after the enactment of the Government of India Act, 1935, the subject matter of prisons was transferred to provincial governments, ending the reform push and resulting in non-uniformity in prison policy after India became independent. Before independence, many provinces set up their own committees for prison reforms. United Provinces Jail Inquiry Committee 1928, the Committee on Prison Reforms in Mysore. 1940, Up Jail Reforms Committee 1946, and Bombay Jail Reforms Committee 1946. The pursuit continued after independence, with Punjab 1948, Madras 1950, and Orissa 1952 being the early states to set up jail reform committees. However, faced with more pressing problems, the focus on jail reforms took a back seat. Soon after independence, the Government of India, in 1951, invited a technical UN expert, Dr. W.C. Reckless, to study prison administration and suggest ways to improve prisons. Dr. Reckless, in his report, recommended transforming jails into reformation centers and revising the outdated jail manuals. Over time, the Government of India set up several jail reform committees. The more important ones are and the central government also framed a model prison manual in 2003 and in 2016. In 2023, it introduced the Model Prison Act, 2023, to replace the Indian Prisons Act, 1894. The above efforts by the central government were aimed at modernizing prison administration and introducing reforms suited to the needs of changing times. However, since prisons fall under the state list, most states are still governed by the Prisons Act, 1894, and have stubbornly refused to implement reform recommendations. The states have also wantonly refused to comply with the directives and judgments of the Supreme Court of India relating to prison reform, including those in Sunil Batra v Delhi Administration, SC 1978, Hussainara Khatun v State of Bihar, SC 1979, Sheila Bars v State of Maharashtra, SC 1983, Gurdev Singh v State of Punjab, SC 2002. In the case of Ramamurthy v State of Karnataka, the Supreme Court identified the following 9 areas requiring urgent reform, and in this case began with a letter dated June 13, 2013 from Justice R. C. Lahoti, former Chief Justice of India, to the Honorable Chief Justice of India, drawing attention to the disturbing and inhuman conditions prevailing in 1,382 prisons, particularly overcrowding, unnatural deaths of prisoners, gross inadequacy of staff, and the fact that available staff are either untrained or inadequately trained. As on the date of writing this piece, despite several directions from the Supreme Court from time to time as part of this case, jails continue to remain in despicable condition. As part of this case, the Supreme Court in 2018 also set up a committee headed by former Supreme Court Justice Amitava Roy, with a comprehensive mandate. The committee submitted detailed reports on what ails Indian jails, along with key reform measures. Nothing much has happened beyond that. 2 centuries have elapsed since the beginning of efforts to reform Indian jails, but they continue to be what they started as living hells. States have refused to implement the comprehensive recommendations of committees, commissions, the central government's reform initiatives, and even directives of the Supreme Court, while inmates continue to languish in inhuman conditions. It is a stop-and-gloss time. The central legislature, executive, and judiciary must act in unison. The immediate actions needed arena and the journey of transforming jails into reformative institutions must begin with making living conditions humane and respecting the rights of prisoners. Swipe left for next video. Prisons are only one part of the broader criminal justice system. Reforming jails is intricately linked to reforming the police, prosecution, judiciary, and legal aid system. In the next and concluding part of this series, I will delve deeper into the key judicial reforms that are urgently needed. Latest blogs.